Social Research Foundation has been uncannily accurate in its polls heading into the May 2024 election. And, well, even before that, which makes it a little different to many of the polls around the world. Its latest poll, given that track record, is a huge shock for the ANC. A huge shock. We're going to find out more from Gabriel Makin, who's the Director of Research at the Social Research Foundation. Now, did I read that correctly, Gabriel, that the ANC has gone from around 40% in the May election up to 45% in September? That's the last time we spoke to your colleague from the SRF, France Grenier. And to the latest poll, 32%. Can that be true?
Hi, Alec. Yes, I was about as shocked as you sound when I first was looking at the poll numbers. But I think what we see here definitely makes a lot of sense. But top line, the most important thing for your viewers is that the ANC is at 32%, but nothing else really changed from September when we did our last poll. So the DA remains at 25%. The MK party remains about 12%, EFF's at 6%, IFP's at 3%, PA's at 2%, but there's a 4% margin of error on these numbers, so there's a bit of wider variance. But the thing that has grown is the number of undecided voters in South Africa's voting market, and this is truly undecided voters. So we have about 15% of likely voters who we cannot assign to any party. So why we were so accurate in our previous polls is we used various methods to assign voters to the different parties. And it's not just the question, who are you going to vote for in the next election? We also use leader favorability and party favorability. And we do that for every single party and every single leader. And if a voter indicates strong favorability above a certain threshold towards a single party or towards a leader, then we can also allocate them to that party when we're doing the final turnout model. But this time, it's the first time in which we have 15% of voters are actually undecided, in that they say they don't know who they're going to vote for. And when we check them against all of the different thresholds for party and leader favorability, that we cannot allocate them to any party. They're like none of them.
Okay, so let's just understand this a little more clearly. You said, first of all, there's a 4% error margin. So does that mean, all other things being equal, the ANC might be as high as 36%, but it could be as low as 28%?
Yes, but when we're dealing with these numbers, obviously you can't have on an election day 15% of the vote be undecided. And so I think we should be responsible here and say the ANC is probably not at 32%. If there was an actual election happening, it would probably be in the low to mid 40 range, round about the range we found it in September, because those voters who can say they're undecided in 2025 when there's no election forthcoming and when the GNU has lost its kind of new shine, they can say now, I'm undecided, I don't know. But when an election comes, they will pick someone, and it's very likely that they are from the ANC camp. And at the moment, we see no reason why they wouldn't just move back into the ANC camp. But you mustn't necessarily think of those voters as just ANC voters. They are free agents in the South African voting market. They can move whatever direction, and they will probably be the source of the most political contestation, because that chunk of 15% will be able to swing the balance of power in South African politics going forward.
Okay, so I get it. So there's this now this moving vote, this 15%. But if you go back to what we've been told by politicians over a period of time, especially Helen Zille, who at the BizNews conference 3 years ago said that the ANC will fracture and that the real future will be between DA on the one side and EFF on the other. Well, it seems as though the MK party has now gone into that EFF space, but let's just leave that for a moment. it does appear previous ANC voters who are now undecided will be up for grabs. But from your perspective, from the polls that you're reading, how undecided are they? In other words, are these guys likely to vote for another party if they perceive come the next election, which is not even 2 years away, in the local elections, if they perceive that the ANC is really mucking it up?
So the quick answer to that question is they are completely undecided, and they, I think, are completely free and can be picked up by any party. But I can say that with such certainty is our first poll was in 2022, and there were a lot of phenomenally interesting results that we got from that poll. One of the most important being that the South African population en masse is very moderate and pragmatic in its values. So it's not in favor of large scale expropriation. It's not in favor of the more populist policies that the ANC has been propagating the last few years. So the ANC we knew from 2022 was ahead of its voters. It was leaving its voters behind, and its voters were not interested in the more populist direction of the ANC. We also then did a kind of market segmentation of the South African voter market. So we thought, let's create kind of 4 brackets: available, in reach, peripheral, and unreachable, to define what percentage of the South African voter market is worth contesting, and what percentage of the South African voter market have their opinion set in stone. And we found about 80% of the South African vote market, so this is amongst registered voters, uh, is either in reach or available, which means that political parties, given the right messaging and significant enough resource investment, might be able to swing those voters towards them. And then the last thing that we found, which is the most important thing to tell us why the ANC is in this position it finds itself today, is we did this little word association game. I think France has probably spoken about this a few years ago, but it's worth reminding your viewers about. What we did is we took a number of different words or phrases, such as racist, violent, anti-poor, makes broken promises, has good policies, all of these things, and we asked simply, which party does this word or phrase describe best? And there were 2 words that the ANC had and phrases that the ANC had an outright majority on. It was makes broken promises and only cares about themselves. They had a plurality that thought they were anti-poor. When it came to the DA's associations were has good policies, best at providing service delivery, best at providing clean governance, best at providing good leadership. And when it came, just as a fun thing, when it came to the EFF, they were violent and racist, according to the word associations. But what this word association game kind of showed us at the time was that the ANC had lost the perception amongst South African voters that it was the source of good governance in the country and that it could be trusted with its policy agenda. And instead, it was viewed very, very skeptically and very negatively. But at that time, we found the last thing that explains all of this was we found that there were 2 major factors driving ANC support at that point. It was the fear of what happens when the ANC loses its majority. We asked questions such as, if the ANC lost its majority, do you think that there would be violence in your community? And about 60 to 70%, I can't remember the exact numbers, of ANC voters agreed with this idea. So we could see that there was a trend of ANC voters being very worried about what happens if the ANC were to lose an election, so to speak. And then the other thing was that ANC voters generally were quite skeptical of what the opposition parties had to offer. So they thought, when it came to ANC voters, they associated the DA about as racist at about the same rate as they associated the EFF as racist. They were not sure that the DA offered them a substantive improvement to the ANC. And so all of these factors combined at the time to make it make sense to us that the ANC has a significant part of its voter base that are just staying out of kind of a fear of what happens if they lose and a fear of what the opposition are offering. Now we cut forward, 3 years, and what we've seen is seen load shedding, we've seen the propagation of NHI, Bella, EWC. So we've seen the ANC advance on its more populist policies, something that we knew was unpopular with its base. We've seen the ANC be unable to provide basic services in the form of electricity, but win it back. But then we finally saw the ANC face an election where it lost its majority. And the day after, there wasn't violence, there were coalition negotiations. And so that key factor upholding ANC support suddenly drops away. Suddenly, every ANC voter has seen that their worst fears the day after the election weren't realized. The thing is that the other part of the puzzle, the skepticism around opposition parties, well, since the GNU has been formed, there probably hasn't been enough time and enough evidence for the ANC voters to associate the other parties with good governance or with an improvement over the ANC. But they are now in the position in which they don't have to be fearful of what happens if the ANC loses. And so they can instead bide their time and in a non-important year, such as 2025, actually sit and watch and wait to see how the South African political situation develops, because they no longer find any home in South African politics, but they are likely to vote. And so they want to see what happens if they give some time to see how things develop.
Sure, that's fascinating stuff because it does open the path, one might be able to argue, for someone new. We did see Herman Mashaba try to take that path. Well, Action SA seems to have fallen off that pedestal. Is that the possibility? I mean, you guys at the SRF are very close to what's going on in the political scene. Do you think that there is, or have you got any feedback on someone new entering that market? And as a rider, the change in the Freedom Front Plus leadership, which will be Corné Mulder will be playing a very different game, it appears, to the one that was played by Peter Groenewald in the past, might also bring them into the discussions, even though they didn't score high enough to get onto your poll.
So they did score. They were on our poll. We try not to give too many numbers of parties that fall within the margin of error, because we essentially know very little about where those parties in the margin of error will land. And so it's best for us to remain cautious and talk about the big parties who, on margin of error, we can say something solid about. But what you're saying about new parties, I think, is a very important point. And it's something that Jacob Zuma in the last election capitalized on. We had been saying since 2022 that there's this huge chunk of the ANC voter base that's available that doesn't associate their party with anything good, that is just sticking in that party out of fear of what happens. And now, when the election came along, Jacob Zuma offered a significant chunk of those previous ANC voters a better story, or a story that was, we think, at least related to them in a way that the ANC no longer did, in that they felt the persecution of the ANC. I think France has been on here and outlined what our theory driving MK support is, but I think that the MK's performance bears that out. And now ANC supporters are once again in the position in which their party is moving past them and implementing radical populist policies, that they no longer have to fear about what happens if the ANC loses its majority. And so they can sit and watch. And that means that any party, this, when we say that these voters are undecided, we mean it. They could move to any party. They are likely to vote. When we do the buckets of questions that we always do to figure out which of the people who responded are the likely voters, they reach the threshold to be likely voters. They're going to vote in the next election, but they don't know where they're going to vote, and they really don't. And so you can see in this poll, some of the important factors that are driving support away from the ANC is that about 2/3 of our poll are anti-EWC. We asked their feelings on expropriation a number of different ways. We asked, is it a good economic idea? 2/3 majority said no. We asked, can the government be trusted to expropriate property? 2/3 of the government said no. And we asked, will this drive away foreign investment? And 2/3 of the South Africans said, yes, this will drive away foreign investment. So the same amount of people, the same group, was anti-EWC, and about 60% of ANC voters we found were anti-EWC. And we also found in this poll that although Cyril Ramaphosa is upholding ANC support, as he's always done, he is no longer viewed favorably outside of the ANC. One of the, I think, key findings of this poll that we haven't touched on is that when we asked two questions about a vote of no confidence in Cyril Ramaphosa, well, a vote of no confidence or him resigning. So on the question of a vote of no confidence, the data splits essentially 50-50, with a slight majority in favor. But then on the question of him resigning because of his poor performance, the data starts to split at about 60-40 in favor of him resigning. So he no longer commands a positive view in the country amongst non-ANC voters. And then one of the most interesting things we did was that we said, okay, so if there were to be a motion of no confidence that was successful and an election afterwards, who would you vote for? And under those circumstances, the ANC drops to 21%, the DA moves up to about 28%, everyone else stays about the same, but the undecideds move up to about 20%. And
Just
so,
explain that. Explain exactly. Just unpack that for us, because that's a critical change to what we used to.
yes, so we asked the question, should there be a vote of no confidence? Then we asked the question, if there was a successful vote of no confidence that therefore triggered an election, who would you vote for? And that under those conditions, so they now have to think, okay, there's been a vote of no confidence. Cyril Ramaphosa is not the president of the ANC, but everyone else remains the same. The DA moves up slightly to 28%, becomes the biggest party under those conditions. The ANC, without Cyril Ramaphosa as president, gets about 21%, and every other party stays the same. And the only growth, therefore, is really in the undecideds, which sit at 20%, which makes the undecideds the third biggest party in South Africa under those conditions. And so if President Ramaphosa no longer finds himself as president of South Africa, it tosses a whole number of new interesting challenges to the ANC, because he seems to be anchoring their support. But the problem is that the ANC is that a majority of people are now opposed to President Ramaphosa's leadership. They want to see a motion of no confidence in him, or they want him to resign. And so it's a terrible conundrum that the ANC find themselves in.
Sheepers, these are really, really hectic findings that have come through here. And I guess if you guys hadn't been so damn accurate up to this point, people could easily write it off. But surely opposition parties will look at this, think it through, and act accordingly. And if they were to do so, just on if only what you have in the results of your poll were of any consequence, what would the rational response be?
Well, the rational response is okay, the ANC is the only one that seems to have been punished for what they're doing. What has happened since September of last year, when the last time we polled, in which the ANC was at 45%, to now, where the ANC is at 32%, really at 40 if there were an election, but there's these free agents in the voter market? Well, the ANC has decided to continue in its policy path unchanged from the GNU from the previous parliament to this new parliament under the GNU. They pursued Bella, they pursued NHI, they were pursued expropriation. Cons- Three policies that are consistently unpopular amongst all South Africans and even amongst ANC's voter base. And especially this poll was happening. Remember, one must remember that a poll is a moment of time. We did this from about the 3rd of February to about the 17th of February. And so we did this in the height of the positive media response to expropriation, the kind of justification. This is a cosmetic change. This isn't. It was correctly read by the South African population as an undermining of their property rights. They understood this, despite the fact that the media insisted it wasn't, despite the fact that most political parties insisted it wasn't. So average South Africans understand this because they live in the real world and they see the effects of ANC policy. This means that the ANC's current agenda is unpopular and it's driving their support down. And the ANC kind of know this. The SRF has been publishing data on this for years now, and always we come to these same conclusions. These aren't just new things we're finding. On BEE, we found previously that there's 80% of people who are in favor of appointments on merit and not on race. When we found on the question of BEE procurement, it breaks 75-25 in favor of colorblind procurement. The ANC's most populist agenda is incredibly unpopular. So if I'm a logical, rational opposition party, say the DA, I realize that what people want is legitimate reform, and they want to see that the country is moving in the right direction on that. And they can, and so there is a huge amount of space for you to push for that, because the ANC cannot say that its voter base wants the policies it's pushing, because every time the ANC has pushed on the more populist policies, we've seen in the polling that it suffers. We just as an example of this, prior to the election, we had the ANC trend up every single day for about 2 weeks, and this is significant, and moved from about 40 to 46, and then NHI happened, and then it started to backslide again. These voters have a much, much, much deeper understanding than the media, than politicians generally assign to them on the effects of legislation. And so if you are an opposition party who wants to push reform legislation, then you realize that voters will pay attention and they will reward you if you do things that they think will improve their lives. And they have more of an understanding of what will improve their lives than the ANC generally tends to give to them. And so treat the voters as rational, objective politics watchers, and pursue policies that you know will improve their lives, and all you will be is rewarded. And why can I say that with such certainty? Well, one, it's what I've painted to you with the ANC. Every time the ANC advances on the populist policies, it loses vote share. But the only time in South Africa's democratic history in which the ANC has gained vote share was the period from 1994 to 2004. In the two successive elections, it grew in its vote share. And you've had France on, who can deliver this much more eloquently than I can. But the reason why the ANC grew during that period was that it improved the material circumstances of the average South African. And if you are able to do that, you will be rewarded. And if you're not able to do that, and if you pursue policies that people understand harms their material circumstances, you will lose vote share.
It's pretty rational the way that you put it there. But just so that we understand, this is before the budget and before stage 6 load shedding. This poll.
Exactly. It came out of the field last week, Wednesday.
So before the budget, the disaster that went on there and the proposal for a 2 percentage point VAT increase, if you were to work those into the figures, it wouldn't be better for the ANC. I mean, clearly, it would have to be perhaps an even worse result.
Definitely. Although it probably would only have filtered in maybe a 1 or 2 percentage point decrease or increase in the number of undecideds, but it's not going to inspire much confidence in the average ANC voter. It's not going to bring people flocking back in.
Have you ever seen a result quite as shocking as this? If you were, say, working for the ANC and you got these figures, has there at any point in time been anything that would have scared you more?
Yes. Last year, when we began our election tracking poll, we had the ANC sitting at 37%. Now it got 40%, and but that was the most disastrous election that the ANC has ever had by a large mile. And so the points that the SRF was making, what was driving the ANC support at that point, are the same points that we are making now, which is you have abandoned your voter base. You don't know what your voter base wants, or maybe you do, but you've decided that it's more important to pursue your radical populist policies and abandon the fundamentals the fundamentals for them. And so you've now, for the second time, you're seeing that as a result, you will get punished by the voters. And so I think it should have been more shocking to them at round about this point last year, maybe a few months on, what the polls were showing, which was that they were going to lose more than, at that point, we were showing that they were going to lose 20% of their vote from 2019 to 2024. What we're showing now is, you're kind of 8 percentage points down from the previous election. But if you only lost 8 percentage points from 2019 to 2024, you'd actually be quite happy. But what this does imply is that if South Africa continues to move in this trend, we are going to have an electoral system that resembles the countries that we actually model our electoral system on. That the ANC will only be able to, at best, command a vote share of 30 to 35%. And so you're moving towards that, and you shouldn't be shocked that you're moving towards that, because you haven't done anything to change the course that you were on when you lost the 17% in the previous election. You may have brought other parties into the government with you, but you haven't shown voters that you are willing to work with them, or that you are willing to pursue a different course based on a new partnership.
Professor Richard Tedlow says that in his wonderful book, Giants of Enterprise, he describes a concept called derangement. And derangement is about being too far away from the reality. In other words, you have people around you who put 2 spoons of sugar in your tea, or make sure that you don't go through the normal issues of life. He was talking about CEOs. It appears from what you've told us today, Gabriel, that this can happen in politics as well. Gabriel Makin is the Director of Research at the Social Research Foundation. I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.